So a central goal in this series is to communicate what makes cooperative enterprise unique. As a business model that's equitably owned and democratically controlled by its members, the people who actively use the organization to meet their shared needs and goals, rather than maximizing return on capital. The co-op model is focused on meeting member needs, with profit or surplus being reinvested in the business or returned to members according to their use of the business, which can mean your purchases, the products you have processed, or the labor you contribute. Yes, I usually try to make a point of just mentioning the impact of co-ops in rural America. Co-ops provide power to more than half the US land mass. More than half of America's family farmers are also members of co-ops. Of course, there's the farm credit system, and farmers played a key role in pioneering mutual insurance.
Sure, I would, having worked at NRECA for 36 years, I would say I'm very proud of that graphic, and I think any farmer and rancher who's on this call will recognize that the electric cooperative success story is also the success story of a strong agricultural economy in the United States, and the fact that rural America, while struggling in some areas, in other ways continues to thrive. Do a mind experiment there and think about, without the coming of electricity from the 1930s forward, what would rural America look like today? It's a frightening thought.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the fact that so much of that was accomplished through cooperatives, I think, is something we want to remember as we look forward to future, not just challenges, but opportunities in the economy. So co-ops are also not just a business model. We were just talking about this a little bit, but they're also an international movement based on shared values that puts people at the heart of economics rather than capital. And of course, that's what we're trying to dig into today. What we're trying to do here is share some key points around how the cooperative identity as we know it today, the definition, the values, the principles that guide our movement, are really the result of an ongoing dialogue and collaboration among a diverse and international movement. These are principles that have evolved over time. They continue to evolve. And part of our goal here is to share some of that history with people, and also engage them a little bit with that process moving forward, especially as it's relevant to the Cooperative Congress. So one of the things that always comes back to me, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but as I've learned more and more about the cooperative movement, not just its origins, but where it pops up now in history, is that growth is so often linked to times of dramatic change and uncertainty. The birth of the modern cooperative movement really was in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, the development of global capitalism, and accompanying these developments was just a wrenching change in rural economies, in the lives of farmers, artisans, and working people. And just as in our time, there's this shift in haves and have-nots, in influence over politics, dramatic insecurity, and just an uncertainty about the future. And I wonder if you want to speak to that at all, in terms of the conversations we've been having, just about the future, and how we contend with it.
Well, sure. If you look at those bullet points, and you did a picture of, let's say, the COVID-19 virus instead of the Coolbrook at night, and it didn't say Industrial Revolution in England, but it said global economy and the pandemic, every one of those items is relevant today, hundreds of years later. And that's a frightening thing. But particularly the shift in wealth, concentration, economic control. But think of the working conditions in the slaughterhouses and meatpacking factories as the pandemic spread. Food insecurity, major. Environment now, much more serious from the point of view of climate change. Real concerns about access to healthcare. So this slide is not ancient history. And one would hope that the cooperative model would be seen by many, as it was by the Rochdale pioneers, as at least the beginning of a solution to these significant issues.
Right, right. And certainly as we talk about the contemporary cooperative principles, we often point to the Rochdale pioneers and the way in 1844 they used this very simple structure of the member-owned grocery store, this focus on pure food, to meet the needs of their members, but they always had this broader goal in their mind of this cooperative commonwealth. And they are credited with establishing formal cooperative principles. But what I always like to, remind people of is the pioneers really were building on very long and diverse traditions of mutual aid, whether you're talking about indigenous societies, later experiments in social ownership, lending circles. Some of the models many of us in rural communities are familiar with, such as land clearing, collective harvest. The tradition of the Rochdale pioneers is very much rooted in and learned from all of those experiences as well as all of the experiments in cooperative enterprise, both the ones that worked and the ones that failed. And I think so the way I try to frame this for folks when we talk about the principles is, the real gift of the Rochdale pioneers to us today was that they were building on these diverse traditions to create a set of rules, sort of a new assemblance of rules and operational ideas that had actually, many of them had been tried before, if not all of them, just not in the same combination. And in doing so, they demonstrated this ability of working people to control their own destinies. And they proved that it was possible and inspired this development of a set of principles in the future. Like, they didn't even talk about a set of principles when they were working.
No, that's right. And in fact, one of the leaders of the group, Charles Haworth, who's referred to sometimes as the Thomas Jefferson of Rochdale, he saw this as a practical issue because they had raised capital from the people, and they still hadn't gotten co-op off the ground, and previous co-ops had failed. And so people were beginning to say, either give me my money back or make something happen here. And to create a sense of trust and confidence, Haworth wrote down a set of rules that he felt were going to be important for people to understand that they were in fact protecting their capital, and it was their capital, and that there would be a return on their capital, and they would still be able to keep prices reasonable and keep price gouging and poor quality commodities out of the marketplace. So it was a very practical set of rules that he was putting in place.
Well, and not just in our own sector, you're reminding me of, my current work with the Neighboring Food Co-op Association, and a lot of our startups, it's not uncommon for them to take as many as 10 years to actually get a store open. And in the meantime, you have to find ways to engage those members who have invested their time and energy and resources in what it is you're building toward. And I do think that the pioneers and other sort of experimenters in this model really created a set of guidelines that could help people focus on the future, what it is they're trying to build together, and less about the immediate benefit.
That's a terrific point. And in my neighborhood, I'm in Washington, D.C., and south of us in Fredericksburg, Virginia, there's a new cooperative called the Fredericksburg Food Cooperative, first food co-op in the area. That's exactly what happened, Urban. It took 3 years, which actually is rather quick in terms of capitalizing it and so on. And it is now open and hugely successful, but you had to have a common vision.
Right.
There had to be a common vision in the community to keep people interested and willing to put up some initial member equity.
Right, right. So, I think we're talking about how that's relevant in our own time. And certainly at the time of the pioneers, their example was very inspiring for all of these same reasons. And the cooperative movement was internationalist from its beginnings. Organizers from many countries were getting together already to share ideas, share models, share what worked, what didn't. And I think, the example of the pioneers really sparked the formation of the Cooperative Alliance in 1895, with the goal of really cross-pollinating across borders, across different types of co-op movements, establishing economic relationships, and importantly, really understanding first what it was that was working about Rochdale and how that could be translated into other sectors, other countries, other traditions, and then ensure sort of not just the promotion, but the defense of those principles over time.
Exactly. You could add into that too the Raiffeisen movement in Germany, where you have in England primarily, or the UK, you're focusing on mostly consumer cooperatives and commodity purchases. In Germany, they're looking at the whole financial system, and there you had the beginning of the credit union movement that made its way across the Atlantic to Canada first and then into the US.
Right. Right. And a key challenge of the ICA is how you translate those basic principles in a way that's applicable across sectors, especially, when you're starting with a set of principles that really emerge from the consumer co-op sector. And that was a key task over time, which we'll get into a little bit. We were talking a little bit yesterday just about how the different lists of rules and operational sort of priorities and the number of different lists. Like, it's really interesting when you study Rochdale and how those practices became translated into principles, how many different lists you can look at and which of those are prioritized by different sort of historians or recorders. The early lists that we were talking about included everything from gender equality to selling pure food at an honest weight, right? From equity provided by members to limitations on return on capital. But the lists vary. And it took a long time before the movement really settled in on, okay, here's what we think is the distillation of what makes the co-op model different.
And if we looked at promotion of education for a second, the original that Howarth wrote down was quite interesting. It was to make sure that the accounts were audited and transparent to the members, and that there would be frequent release of balance sheet information to every single member so that they could trust again that the business itself that they had put their money into was in fact honest, open, transparent, and that idea actually comes up, as we'll see later, in the addition of the ethical values.
Right. That's an excellent point, because so much of it really was focused on financial literacy and economic empowerment, not just education in a broad sense, but very specifically how you own and manage this entity and hold it accountable to your community over time.
Right.
So that list of principles actually stood the test of time for quite a while, until the 1930s, when a number of influences globally started to raise questions about the relevance of that list of priorities. And so externally, you had the rise of fascism, you had the Russian Revolution. Internally, you had growing internationalism, although it was still mostly European. There were some examples, I believe, like Argentina was involved at that point. There was a growing international scope. And maybe more importantly, as you were talking about before, there was this challenge of adapting the principles to cross-sector cooperative movement. How do you make it relevant to credit unions, farmer cooperatives, worker co-ops, et cetera?
As a side note, when we look at fascism there, this is a difficult period of time because the intent is to be politically neutral and not to get involved at all in the politics of the country. And today, those efforts are made where we have, China, we have Russia, we have Europe, and so on. At this point, Italy and Germany were not allowed to continue in the International Cooperative Alliance. People may look back on that and say, I question whether that was the right move, but the concern about the growth of fascism was so strong that they were excluded from meetings until after the war.
Yeah. It was, part of the St. Mary's program we were just talking about in cooperative management. We actually took a trip to Italy to visit the movement there, and it was really interesting to learn about the history of how the cooperative movement was really under assault by fascists. Cooperatives were actually destroyed, taken over, and the sort of pride that many of the cooperatives held that they survived and actually came through the other side of those challenges and continued to grow is a really interesting history that I don't know if we're as familiar with here in the States. But so the result of this dialogue around the principles resulted in a revision that interestingly included a list of essential principles and then additional principles and then non-obligatory principles. And I think part of what you were getting at there a little bit is the movement was really trying to figure out how to maintain its cohesiveness at a time of real division, right? Some of those principles there would be contested by certain parts of the movement globally. And so to me, when I look at this list, it's very visible how the movement was really struggling to maintain some kind of shared understanding of its identity and what its purpose was in the middle of all this conflict. Is that how you read it, or do you have other thoughts on it?
No, I agree. But as you look at the list and you look at the essential principles in particular, they were really shrinking it down to say this is about open democratic processes that ensure there's a distribution of patronage capital at appropriate times, proportional to your use of the system, or your patronage, and stuck by the view that interest on capital should be limited and not put in a speculative capitalist framework.
Right.
So they really did hone it down, and I'm wondering, this is just talking out loud, whether it really was about trying to figure out how the fifth principle, an additional one, of political and religious neutrality, was going to work out in 1937.
Yep, yep. So then the next period when sort of a revision of the principles came up was in the 60s. And obviously this was the time of the Cold War, decolonization. You saw post-colonial movements, third world solidarity movements, and internally the ICA saw a huge growth in non-European representation. Many of these states, some of them newly independent, becoming involved, and this continuing growth in the cross-sector sort of aspects of the ICA. And in addition, I think you saw a lot of sort of the older movements in Europe experiencing a lot of success through federated bodies and associations, through group buying and selling and shared economic power. Is there anything you'd share on that period?
I would focus on the post-colonial point,
yeah,
and think about phenomenal growth in Asia Pacific, in Latin America. And then I would point out that we're still working hard in Africa,
yeah,
in a post-colonial sense, to build a strong cooperative movement, and that's beginning to happen around youth.
Mm-hmm.
Young people are really coming together in many, many African nations in worker cooperative frameworks. So again, this is 1963 to 2021. Africa has taken the long road in a post-colonial economy, but I see great progress occurring now.
Yep, yep. So the resulting principles were approved in 1966. Again, these were a little bit more, but they included voluntary membership, which I sort of read as a reaction state influence over cooperative development. Mentioned in the principles. Anything you'd add there before we keep moving?
Well, number 6, we're still working on, as we'll see as we get into the revisions that occurred in 95 and what we're talking about now. Cooperation among cooperatives was a word change. But if you think about that, for our participants on this call, how much do we really do cross-sectorally in cooperative cooperation? Not as much as we might. Even with sectors, how much cooperation do we see? So it's in 1966 that this subject first came forward. First time.
Yep.
And yet we're still working on that question of, to what extent is this possible? And to what extent is it likely? And what would be the positive economic impacts and social impacts if we saw much more cooperation among cooperatives, including cross-sectoral.
Right, right. This goes back in some ways to the educational principle sort of through a different lens, really. And that's been a focus of our work in our Food Co-op Association, is simply educating, our more than 100,000 individual members about the cooperative identity of credit unions, about the importance of supporting farmer cooperatives when they do their shopping. But interestingly,
Right.
a lot of things we might take for granted is like, oh, of course, we should all understand the cooperative identity of these other sectors. We've really found that, there's a fertile opportunity in that type of education. Like, most people really are not aware of the depth of the cooperative economy around them, and there are so many opportunities to engage in it and sort of build that shared strength. And I agree, it's an ongoing challenge that needs to be part of our educational efforts. So that brings us a little bit closer to present, with the 1980s and the growth in global capitalism, basically.
The issue in Africa became one of government interference. And we found Pan-Africa model legislation suggesting that any cooperative should be controlled by a government agency at the national level. That is still going on in some areas, and we're at pains to try to get that changed through legislatures so that the autonomy and independence of the cooperative can truly be the case. We can go ahead and fast forward a little bit, because this presentation all has a theme about the evolving nature of the principles from 1844 all the way up to the present. And so as we move past the 1966 period, and then to 1995. 1995, of course, is the 100th anniversary of the International Cooperative Alliance. So there was a big meeting in Manchester, another World Congress, and that's where the principles were very strongly codified. The values were added. A definition of cooperatives was added. And you now had the statement on the cooperative identity, which you can find easily on ica.coop, which is the three pieces: the definition of a cooperative, the principles, and the values. That was not something that simply happened overnight. That process started in as early as 1980, picked up steam, and then in 1992, we had the beginning of the thinking about values, and exactly the slide that we now have on the screen, miraculously, on how the Swedish president of the ICA, Sven-Åke Buch, did a report to the ICA in 92, once again stressing the critical importance of addressing capital requirements, capital availability, and the fact that this is member capital, not externally generated capital. And then finally suggested that we needed to finalize this evolution of the universal principles, added cooperative values, add ethical values. That's 92. It's not until 1995 that, in fact, we see the codification of this in 1995 at the Manchester meeting, led under the work of Professor Ian Macpherson, the late Ian Macpherson, sad to say, a wonderful person, professor, University of Victoria in British Columbia. And he led that 3-year process of many, many discussions and sessions around the desirability of looking at the principles, the values, and the definition of a cooperative on an integrated basis. So I would just point out on Concern for Community that that is the short version, which you'll find in the principle, the 7th principle. And that was really intended to re-energize the idea that while we are businesses that are about economic efficiency in the marketplace, we also have a social responsibility and the potential for a strong social impact. The word sustainability actually becomes a much more contemporary word for us when we think about a sustainable environment, a sustainable economy, and what role cooperatives can have in that. And I'll hold off on further remarks there for a little later in the presentation. But the addition of that seventh principle has generated a lot of discussion around the world about what is contained in that. How much running room do we have in terms of the role of cooperatives in a sustainable globe, which generally is defined as ensuring that resources are available to future generations, while at the same time maintaining price stability and availability of quality products and goods. Well, let me go ahead and on the definition. This is the first time there was a definition. We won't go over this in detail, but being united voluntarily is an important part of it. The association of persons is in distinction to the association of capital interests. Again, we always have to remember that capital is subordinated here. It's the people who control, not the capital investors who are investing for a return. Common economic, social, and cultural needs. Urban mentioned Italy related to World War II. I would mention Italy in terms of being one of the great examples of cultural cooperatives and the importance of culture in all levels in Italy, whether it's performing arts, gourmet food, and so on, that fits into their sense of what a cooperative delivers. And of course, the key emphasis there is it's jointly owned and democratically controlled, always will be. No policy should ever be put in place that remove that direct control from the members themselves. So I don't know that the slides can move at this point. Good. As I said earlier, the cooperative values, I think, are critically important. They ring so true today. Self-help really needs to be thought of as mutual self-help. In fact, in other languages, it is translated as mutuality. So when we think in English about self-help, we may think of a self-centered interest. The intent there is it's mutual self-help as an associated group of people. Self-responsibility couldn't be more important these days. Democracy everywhere. Equality and equity fit very well in the discussions we've been having in the US about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And solidarity sometimes is looked at in that as more like what you would look at in a communist country, but solidarity is intended to be the ability of all of us to continue to work together for a common interest. I also think that while the ethical values, we go back one for a second, Urban, while the ethical values apply to everyone, everywhere, how many cases do we have that come to mind immediately of a lack of honesty, a lack of openness, a lack of social responsibility, a lack of caring for others? That should never be happening in a cooperative enterprise. And so those are the values, I think, that ring so true, that bring employee loyalty and member loyalty to the co-op.
So I think where we wanted to wrap up this piece was around, recognizing one of the key contributions that Ian made to this evolving dialogue around the identity was that, in contrast to past formulations where there was perhaps a hierarchy of principles, or an idea that some principles were more important than others, he really asserted that the cooperative identity was a cohesive whole, and that cooperative operation and impact really needed to be understood by adherence to the principles in their entirety, rooted in those values. And I think that marked a real shift in how co-ops understood themselves and the future, of the movement.
The person that we think so highly of, that we've talked about, Ian McPherson, has said that he believes the values are pretty well transcendental and would be unlikely to change, but the principles themselves should change based upon changes in our economic and social environment. So there are a number of discussions today, including diversity, equity, and inclusion, including sustainable environment, including the future of a digital economy and data privacy and citizen rights, all of which need to be seen within the context of the principles. And so the question is how much of that might change by the time we reach a future General Assembly where there would be resolutions to come forward, similar to what we saw in Manchester or in Vienna in 1966, in Paris in 1934, or in the very origin of the International Cooperative Alliance in London in 1895. So I'm very enthusiastic about the program. You can take a look at that program through ICA.coop or the longer ICA Cooperative World Congress.coop, and take a look at it. Participate locally or internationally on it, but we need as much dialogue as we can get in the next year to 2 years that will be helpful to all of us in ensuring that the cooperative model is alive and well and solving many of these economic and social issues that we face as a globe.